If you've been in martial arts for any serious amount of time, you've probably been the recipient at some point of a comment like, "Wow, you sure are strong," delivered in a very disapproving tone. This is especially common in jujitsu and aikido spaces, in my experience. To be clear, there are indeed forms of inappropriate strength in martial arts. Strength used against the vulnerable, for example. There is absolutely no reason a fully grown adult male who has experience in a given art should be ragdolling women and children and beginners. Just endangers people for no good reason. Another example of inappropriate strength is inefficient strength. I think the golden standard for this is when a judo guy tires himself out by stiff arming for a full match. This is inefficient strength because it not only tires out the defender, but it puts him in stasis. His strength cannot be recruited to make any form of meaningful progress. Not to mention that that's training time that's just being wasted. Outside of these scenarios, however, strength, indeed any sort of athleticism, is actually something that ought to be praised. If we consider martial arts in the context of the wider sports ecosystem, this more or less becomes obvious. Would it ever make sense to complain about a rock climber's strength? "Oh, you only beat me because you're so strong." Well, yeah, that's probably part of it, but that's not only just the nature of the sport, but also just reality in the first place. I'm a small, lightweight guy, and at least in the States, I'm more often than not at a severe weight disadvantage in martial arts. Even as a child training, it never really occurred to me to complain about this because the fact of the matter is that I am a small, lightweight guy. Statistically, dealing with people heavier than me is just going to be my average lived experience. Bad mouthing someone's strength or natural gifts just doesn't really do anything to improve me or make them any better either. What I want to hone in on in this video, though, is not necessarily these sorts of unreasonable yet exhaustingly common takes. Instead, I want to discuss how they reveal an epidemic of weak-mindedness in martial arts. Because what complaining about someone else's strength or athleticism in martial arts tends to actually be is a practice in which a person blames another's advantages for their own disadvantages. In other words, what is really being said with these sorts of statements is this: it isn't that I'm weak or that my training is insufficient. It is just that this person used an inappropriate or unique level of athletic ability against me. Or, as the internet would more succinctly put it, it's just cope. This isn't the only way weak-mindedness manifests, though. Another deeply exhausting trend would be the array of comments like, "that would never work in a street fight," or "try that in MMA." The tacit assumption being made by people who say such things is that everyone is training for the exact same reason they are. It implies a rather low level of emotional intelligence when, in martial arts, or really in any situation, your baseline premise for negotiating with reality is that everyone is essentially just like you. Now, these criticisms would absolutely be appropriate if they were brought against someone who is, for example, training MMA and has openly declared their intentions to compete. Obviously, talking about most effective tactics and techniques in that setting is completely appropriate. Telling a wushu practitioner that their art would never hold up in the octagon, on the other hand, is patently ridiculous. What is striking about these sorts of trends is just how common they are. If I were to hazard a guess, it probably comes from two primary reasons. The first would be martial arts marketing, which across the board tends to be a tad deceptive. For example, many martial arts claim to be especially useful for the physically weak. If you've been in martial arts and cross-trained for any amount of time, however, you know that this claim is adopted by seemingly every martial art known to man, and its truth is more of a technicality propped up by a lie of omission. It is absolutely accurate that most martial arts will give a weaker person a better chance against an untrained individual. Indeed, it will give a weaker person a better chance against a trained individual. But this premise has always essentially relied on the trained individual taking advantage of an information gap between themselves and untrained individuals. Or at the very least, the hope is that the physically weaker person is better at the thing than whoever's attacking them. However, today this information gap is much less pronounced. Even the most normie of normies probably knows what an armbar looks like and when they should likely be concerned about getting into one. In the gym, though, this sort of marketing promise really doesn't have much bearing at all because most of your training partners will be operating with similar, if not deeper, information than you. While, yes, superior technique can overcome strength, the amount of experience you need over a person is often pretty significant. This is not something that is advertised in the marketing. In other words, athleticism absolutely matters when the information gap is small or irrelevant. Even so, this sort of marketing has spawned a misplaced ideology that glorifies and even protects physical weakness as a sort of virtue. Again, I would say this is especially true in arts like Aikido, which wants everything to be completely devoid of athleticism nowadays for some reason. Another bit of marketing that goes around would be that combat sport, particularly MMA, is the singular most legitimate martial art around because it can defeat all the other martial arts in its rule set. This is basically the same premise I introduced earlier, but applied to a whole industry. The marketing here quietly presents the idea that all martial arts and all martial arts training fundamentally exist for the sole purpose of fighting. This is, of course, untrue. You can go look up the mission statements and goals of innumerable martial arts right now this second. What you will find in their own official documentation is that there's nowhere that declares that training is explicitly for fighting. In fact, some martial arts very openly and very officially dismiss combative training altogether. Likewise, as pointed out earlier, it isn't difficult to find practitioners in any martial art that simply could not care less about competition or self-defense or really violence in any form. People can whine about these approaches being wrong all they like, but they cannot falsify their current thriving existence. This kind of marketing, much like in the previous example, tends to create a pop culture reinforced ideology that legitimacy in martial arts can solely be found in competitive formats. Now, obviously, all this is somewhat of a vicious cycle. I would argue that it either takes a deeply uninvested person, a weak-minded person, or some combination therein to willingly export responsibility for their personal beliefs to corporate interests. On one hand, people obviously can't be deeply informed about everything. So everyone, even very smart, very mature people, will inevitably have to rely on external sources to develop certain opinions merely because there's only so much time in the day. On the other hand, though, if you have the time and resources to actively project your belief system onto others and judge them along your particular subjective lines, then I personally think you are invested enough in something to be openly shamed for just wholesale adopting marketing gimmicks as your ideology. The second reason I think these sorts of takes persist is largely down to the fact that martial arts are disproportionately skewed towards a young male demographic, which, as a young male myself at one point, I can confidently say is by far the dumbest, most insecure demographic on the planet. And while I'm going to risk coming across as shaking my cane at the younger generation, I think Gen Z has it particularly bad, mostly thanks to the internet. Steroid use has bafflingly become mainstream. There are trends like looks maxing, whatever the hell that is, and countless other unhealthy vanity rabbit holes that really just highlight how insecure male Gen Zers are. Now, again, I'm not really blaming Gen Z inherently for this. I think the world has sort of set them up for this insecurity, given that the received wisdom of the previous generations has more or less structurally fallen apart. Even as a millennial myself, my master's degree has failed to translate into the career I was promised it would as a young man. And my degree isn't even all that obscure. It's not like it's in like ethnic dance studies or something. It's a history degree. I can understand why they feel lost at sea without a tether, Gen Z, that is. So, on one hand, I empathize. On the other, a lot of these sorts of martial arts takes can be debunked with a basic Google search, and a breakdown of once standard societal dynamics doesn't suddenly make a lack of self reflection any less weak. Many creators, myself included, are on record as saying that martial arts don't make better people. Recently, though, I've been revising my position on this. I think I was wrong. Now, I don't necessarily believe that martial arts don't make better people. I believe that currently, martial arts don't incentivize or enforce the process of making better people. If anything, current martial arts implicitly or explicitly incentivize degenerate, weak behavior, or at the very least, are remarkably willing to look the other way. If I were to propose something radical here, I'd suggest that white belt through black belt represent knowledge of the curriculum. Having your black belt should basically just mean you know the fundamentals of a given style or system. Every proceeding rank after that first degree black belt, I think, should be directly tied to a person's quality of character. Because let's be honest, belt ranks have never been an objective standard of skill. This is why sports like Judo use a rating system that is, in practice, really completely divorced from belt rank. In terms of what I mean by quality of character, I mean a second degree black belt and above should be a clear, positive role model in his or her gym and community. Promotion should consider their level of service to the broader community, their relationships with others, and how seriously they work on themselves, not just as a martial artist, but as a person, leader, and professional. I would go as far as to say that any promotions beyond black belt must receive unanimous support from both those of higher rank and lower rank, all of whom should be willing to vouch for the person with their name on the line. Similarly, I would tie people's ability to use my name in their own business endeavors to these latter promotions. I don't care if you are the world champion 6 times over. You should not receive anyone's blessing to teach if you're a shitty person. On that note, it should go without saying what sort of things would cause a person to be forever stuck at first degree black belt. Things like rampant steroid abuse, being a sexual predator, scamming people of their money, and otherwise getting into frequent fights outside of sanctioned environments. Obviously, some of these would require some humanity to judge. Kids make mistakes, and I wouldn't necessarily bar a young adult from the ability to improve if I found out he cheesed 1 tournament with steroids. But 2 or 3, especially after being found out, maybe that's all it takes for me. And obviously, I really think these sorts of abuses should really just result in people being stripped of titles, banned permanently from all competition, and, as much as possible, shamed in the broader culture. At this point, I'd understand if some of you are thinking I went from 1 to 100. How the heck did we go from someone giving a backhanded compliment about strength to steroid abuse? The answer to that is that the difference in these behaviors is only a matter of degree. They essentially arise from the same source. The "you sure are strong" commentators and "the only good martial art is the one I like" people both fundamentally fail to look at themselves in the mirror and place what they see into a broader social context. What both of these individuals do is blame others for their own deficits. I have repeatedly seen the same sort of rhetoric in much more serious cases. Steroid users, rather than just admit their dubious morals, tend to default to a basic bitch might is right philosophical argument and then proceed to blame opponents who don't use steroids because that's just the game, bro. I've seen fanboys defend this sort of position as honest, but it has always struck me as insanely selfish and lazy. The tacit statement being made there is that the athlete is more than willing to set a well documented, unhealthy precedent in the sport he supposedly loves in the name of personal glory. I shouldn't even need to give examples of predators blaming their victims. What the steroid abuser has in common with the wow, you're strong guy is that they view the world in a way in which they are never the problem. They don't need to work on themselves. The world simply needs to conform to their degeneracy. Now, of course, giving someone a backhanded compliment about how strong they are is nowhere near as ugly as these other issues. I'm just pointing out that they live on the same spectrum. Personally, I think the appropriate way to deal with the common backhanded, you're really strong statement is offered to help that person work out. Personally, I would love to get more people in the park doing calisthenics with me. I mean, genuinely, I don't even mean this in a facetious way. I would love to have people come out and we just do pull-ups together until we get strong. A rising tide lifts all ships and all that. I'm very much there. I'm happy to lend an olive branch to these kinds of folks. The core point of this video is that I've really come to believe martial arts absolutely can make better people. I simply don't think we currently optimize around that premise. It is wrong to blame martial arts for not creating better humans when those same martial arts seem to actively incentivize degenerate behavior or implicitly accept it, at least, by looking the other way. Would my propositions cause gyms to lose students? Almost absolutely. Hell, promotions would lose champions overnight, I think. But from where I sit, these are students and competitors we really don't want anyway. They are free to go pick something else to actively make worse. To conclude, I just want to say that I think Judo's founder, Kano Jigoro, got so close to achieving something similar to what I would aim for. But in my own reading in between the lines of the history, I think Kano made a bit of a devil's bargain with competition. Now, I'm not saying that competition is bad. It seems to me that Kano understood well the importance of testing oneself and how competition could play a role in the spread of his new system. What it seems to me Kano failed to really transmit in any lasting way is that the real benefits of Judo, and indeed the whole point of Judo, was intended to be found in the regular training sessions. Competition was really something one was supposed to do only once or twice a year to verify growth and identify lacking areas. Beyond not communicating this well, it seems like Kano never really incentivized the learning of his philosophy in a tangible way. Today, Judo plays lip service to maximum efficiency and mutual benefit, but these are more like optional slogans than mandatory principles. Some try to embody those ideals, sure, but I'd suggest that most don't. And I think the reason is that competition eventually emerged as the way to make a name for oneself. Unraveling Kano's philosophical system has largely been relegated to a nerdy side project for a curious few, and naturally, there really is no tangible reward in place for doing so. In fact, even most other judoka literally could not care less. If you start talking about Kano's ideas, they're probably going to tune you out as they're thinking about how to train their favorite technique. Now, fortunately, Judo is not a sport that has been hit as hard with as much degenerate behavior as, say, American MMA or Jiu-Jitsu has. Maybe that has something to do with Judo's point of origin. I'd like to think it does. But my point is that if Kano only built a system of incentive and enforcement around his ideals, they probably would have been taken much more seriously, even up to this day. I think this is the fundamental lesson martial arts need to take away from the judo experiment. Creating better people will only ever remain a theoretical ideal unless incentives and enforcement come with the package. I know I have been laying it on pretty thick in this video, but few things frustrate me quite as much as just how gross certain corners of martial arts culture has become. Much could be said about the practicality of martial arts in earlier decades, mostly about how not very practical it was often, but I can't help but think their hearts might have been in the right place. That virtues like discipline, consistency, long term thinking, and mental toughness were much more valued, even if martial pragmatism was not as polished as it might be today. I'd very much like to see those virtues return. I think we can have our cake and eat it too, but it's going to require actually holding people accountable. And accountability has really been the theme of the day. Anyway, thank you to everyone for watching and listening and your patience in getting this out. How long has it been since I last posted? 4 months or something like that. I should be back more regularly. And on that note, I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.